Good afternoon and welcome to the inaugural Hearst Community Initiative Town Hall Speaker Series. My name is Evan Zislis. I am the Director of Community Engagement for the Aspen Institute's Hearst Community Initiative. The work of HCI is focused on promoting dialogue, increasing understanding, and facilitating opportunities for meaningful collaboration among the communities of Aspen to Parachute, Colorado, located on ancestral lands of the indigenous Ute tribe. Today is the second event of an 8-part speaker series in a collaboration with the regional public libraries and chambers of commerce of Aspen, Basalt, Carbondale, Glenwood Springs, Newcastle, Silt, Rifle, and Parachute. Every 2 weeks from now until the end of July, you can tune in to learn more about the issues facing our communities and the local experts working to find collaborative solutions to the shared challenges of our region. Today's topic is Equity in HR, Best Practices for Small Businesses, co-hosted by the Carbondale Branch Library and the Carbondale Chamber of Commerce. Today's Zoom host is Garfield County Libraries, and interpretation to Spanish is brought to you by Velasco Language Services. Alex, if you would mind, give us a quick introduction and instructions for how to access translation to Spanish.
Of course, thank you, Evan. Allow me to share my screen for just a moment. Okay, as we said, this is being interpreted into Spanish simultaneously. We are also using a chat. If you have any comments or any technical issues you'd like any help with, please type it into the chat and we'll get you set up as quickly as we can. For our interpretation, you will see this gridded globe icon at the bottom right of your screen. Once you click on that, you can choose to have interpretation off. You can choose an English channel or Spanish. Make sure you mute original audio if you're hearing echoes or any interference with the audio. But this is how you choose what channel you want to hear the webinar on. It is being recorded in both English and Spanish. If you need any help with any of the functions, please message me. I will be in the chat ready to help you with that. And with that, back to Evan.
Thanks, Alex. As he mentioned, for today's webinar, please use the chat feature for technical questions. You may ask questions for our panel using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll leave time at the end to answer as many questions as possible. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so I want to introduce our moderator for today's session. It is my honor and privilege to introduce Maisha Renee Forbes. Maisha serves as Vice President for People and Culture at the Aspen Institute. In this role, Maisha oversees all internal talent, human resources, and people functions, and leads processes and structures that ensure that the Institute has the leadership, recruitment, and talent development practices and culture in place to achieve its mission of building a free, just, and equitable society. Maisha previously held the position of Senior Vice President of Culture, Inclusion, and Strategic Advising at Koya Leadership Partners, an executive search and strategic advising firm. There she advised external clients on a wide range of human capital projects, including organizational development, diversity, equity, and inclusion, performance management, and change management. Over the course of her career, she has helped many private and public organizations improve their overall employee experience in ways that reflect the values and culture of the organization. Prior to Koya Leadership Partners, Maisha was Director of Talent Acquisition with KIPP Foundation, the nation's largest public charter school network, where staff more than doubled during her tenure. She also has previous professional chapters with Citizen Schools and Corporate Executive Board, and as a volunteer in various community projects in Chicago. Maisha has a BA in Sociology and African American Studies from Brown University. Joining Maisha today are esteemed panelists Ross Brooks and Brian Alvarez Terrazas. Ross is the CEO of Mountain Family Health Centers. The mission of Mountain Family Health Centers is to improve the health of the community by providing equitable and affordable medical, dental, and behavioral health care for all. Today, Mountain Family provides integrated medical, dental, and behavioral healthcare services to more than 21,000 people across Garfield, Eagle, and Pitkin counties. As CEO of Mountain Family Health Centers, Ross is chief curator and leader of Mountain Family's values, vision, and mission, which includes overseeing the strategic plan, workforce, operations, and clinical care delivery. He is driven by the simple principle that access to affordable healthcare is a human right, not a privilege. Brian is the project manager of the Equity Action Project at Manaus. Brian was born in Glenwood Springs and has lived in the Roaring Fork Valley for the majority of his life. He graduated from Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania with a BA in political science in 2019, and then returned to the Roaring Fork Valley to work in the nonprofit sector. Brian hopes to nurture a community that works to actively dismantle local oppressive systems and forge a region that is better prepared to include and empower diverse leadership. We're honored to have everyone joining us today. I'd like to give a special thanks to Andrea Stewart, Executive Director for the Carbondale Chamber of Commerce, for suggesting this important topic. Maisha, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Evan. I am honored to be here and so excited to be here. My esteemed guests on the panel, Brian and Ross. So before we get started with questions that I will pepper them with around the topic of equity in HR, particularly for small businesses, I just wanted to give a little bit of context. Right now, HR, there are lots of things happening within the sector. There are lots of topics that we could touch on. All businesses, all organizations, companies are looking for a variety of things. They're looking for talent. There's the search for talent. There's the war for talent, they call it, to be more pointed about it. There's also the idea of how do you keep people? How do you retain your talent? What do you do to upskill your talent and ensure that your talent is groomed for your work, for your workforce, for your sector that you're in? There's also technology and how technology is enabling HR to do our work and to do our work better, how it's connecting us in ways that it hasn't done before, and how we utilize it really to amplify our efforts. There's the idea of, what does the workday look like? Working adjustments and flexibility, the idea of collaborative work and how we make that happen, particularly for nonprofits who are in businesses who are working in small communities, and how do you partner with others to have a communal approach to everyone around you? And then also there's just the employee experience, thinking about the entire employee experience from beginning to end, all the way from, thinking about the hire to bringing them on to keeping them and then transitioning them off and sending them somewhere else, or, allowing them to move on, but hoping that they leave as a better professional. How do we do that? How do we empower people to do that? We're going to touch on a lot of those things. We know that those are just big topics within HR. We also know that for small businesses, it looks different. You're operating under very different circumstances, under constrained resources, human, financial, and time. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that. It always feels very forced with regard to how much time in a day you have to do your work and fulfill your causes and missions. Also, when you account for a rural location, you're adding another dynamic, that causes those trends that I mentioned to manifest themselves in very different ways. It also changes your access to talent. It changes, who you can access, who you're looking for, also who you may be able to attract to your work, and how you can keep them. And lastly, when you decide that you want to focus on diversity, inclusion, and or equity, or all the things, that's yet another layer that provides complexity to your work day to day, like day in and day out, but also year over year. Not to mention this little thing called a pandemic that we're all going through. So there you have it. We have lots that we can dig into and discuss. We'll touch on a lot of those topics today with a focus on, the talent and the talent workforce, talent acquisition, and we welcome your questions. The panelists have lots to offer with their rich experiences. So we hope that it will benefit you, and we do hope that you take away something that will be helpful. So with that, I'm going to start with my first question, and it's going to be very general. So we're starting broadly and we'll narrow our way down. Tell me, and this could be either to Ross or Brian, how do businesses, especially small businesses, start thinking about equity? Where do they begin?
Thanks, Maisha. This is Ross. I'll hop in and get us started. So a little bit of background. Our organization, as Evan said, serves about 21,000 folks across Garfield, Eagle, and Pitkin County. And those patients are about 50% Hispanic or Latinx and 50% white non-Hispanic Latinx. In the same way, our staff at Mountain Family is about 50% Hispanic or Latinx and 50% non-Hispanic, non-Latinx. And so when we start to think about equity, we first and foremost think about what do our customers need? So our customers are our patients, and at least half of our patients prefer to be served in Spanish in a culturally competent way. And so we think about that as an employer, excuse me, to employ folks that come from our communities that provide culturally competent and culturally humble care for the needs of our patients across our communities. The other way we think about equity is how are we governed? Who are our bosses at the end of the day? And our governance model is such that the patients govern our community health center. 51% or more of our governing body board of directors has to be patients, real life active users of our community health center. And I think that's a secret sauce for other organizations to consider, because that means we are responsive to and ultimately responsible to the patients of our community that use our services. So for other businesses to think about who are your customers and what are their needs, then when we think about the staff, I'll go back to the point I made earlier that about half of our staff come from Latinx or Hispanic backgrounds and half do not. While that is great for the entry-level jobs at Mountain Family, one of the real challenges we have is to promote and uplift people from our communities into the higher paid jobs in our organization. So our executive team is not very reflective of our communities. Our medical providers, although very talented, compassionate providers, are not very reflective of our community. So we are not diverse as an organization when you look at the top paid people within the organization, starting with me. And so our challenge for the long run is to really build for the long run so that we help uplift folks from our communities to become medical providers, dental providers, behavioral health providers, IT professionals, and executives to lead our organization moving forward.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah, I'd like to touch on that too. And I totally agree with everything that Ross has said. And when thinking about this question, I have a few different parts, a few different responses. I think the first part is asking yourself the what and the why. Specifically, what do you define equity as? Thinking about like, what does equity mean for you? Is your definition based off of your own interpretation of equity, or are you really grounding that definition and understanding in research and what equity means for other people? You know, for me, I'm just gonna put it out there, is the fact that I am Mexican, I identify as Latino, and so a lot of my understanding of equity is coming from that lens. But there are so many different other lenses that you could bring to this work that includes women, LGBTQ+, differently abled folks, and other underrepresented groups that also need to be considered when you're having these discussions. And so once you define equity, then you have to ask yourself, why is it important to you personally and to your organization? Specifically thinking about like, what are we really trying to achieve with this? Are you really just trying to check off a diversity box, or are you really doing it with a sense of humility and understanding and appreciation of what diversity really brings to the table? The second point is to be very self-critical and to be ready and willing to be uncomfortable. You know, a lot of this is really reflecting and looking at yourself internally and thinking about who's making the important decisions, and if decisions are being made in a team, who is in that team and who isn't. Also thinking about who is being promoted and who isn't being promoted, who has the highest wages like Ross was talking about and who has the lowest wages, and who's making the hiring decisions. And if that's an individual or a team, thinking about like how is that composition made up and what sort of powers brought into who makes those decisions. I think also making the time and space to have these discussions and to ask these questions is really important. Setting aside a specific time to talk about this issue and DEI more generally is really important to really getting the ball rolling and thinking about like, how do we define it? What are our goals? What are we trying to accomplish? And you also have to be mindful and pay attention to who could be harmed by these conversations and find ways to support them through this process if they're going to be a part of it, or how you really structure that. And another point is don't tokenize. The definition of tokenism is the practice of doing something like hiring someone that belongs to an underrepresented group only to prevent criticism and give the appearance that people are being treated fairly. And that's one definition, but ultimately it goes back to the what and the why, and what are you really trying to accomplish when you talk about diversifying, when you're talking about equity. And if there is a person of color, somebody who's LGBTQ plus, or someone else that's underrepresented that's on the staff, don't ask them to speak for their whole community. And that's happened to me several times. And I know that happens to my other BIPOC colleagues and other people who come from underrepresented communities. So being really mindful of that, are you asking them something or asking them to do something that you're not asking of everyone else? How is that treatment being different? And another point on the tokenism piece is that being diverse does not mean that you're being equitable or inclusive. And so once again, bringing it back to just checking a box is not the same as, are we actually empowering, are we uplifting those that are already in our spaces or not? And I think the final point is to take action. A lot of times these conversations stay as conversations and don't necessarily lead to action. And so once you do the planning, once you figure out what your goals, your North Star is per se, then thinking about what can we do now that we have this understanding to take it to the next step and actually make action out of this.
Thank you so much, Ryan. You both gave me a lot to unpack there. So I have a couple of follow-ups, if that's okay. I'm gonna go back to something you said very early on, Ross. So you talked about, the community that you served, and you talked about the language, needing to to have ways to communicate in the language of the people that you're serving. To that end, do you find that you have to, as your HR team or kind of as an employer, you have to provide Spanish speaking lessons, or are you relying heavily on the population, the people that you're hiring to do that? Is that something you've thought about?
Yeah, great question. Luckily, we've been able to compensate additional for Spanish speaking providers and Spanish speaking staff, and about half our staff today are bilingual in both Spanish and English. And we have to continue to incentivize that to make sure we're providing culturally relevant and humble and competent care to our communities in need. So that is really a direct reflection of what do our patients and our customers need, is culturally responsive care in a language they feel comfortable receiving. And that's something that we have to invest in and continue to invest in.
Great, that's amazing. And when you say compensate, are you adding to their salary, or are you finding creative ways to add to the total comp package?
Yeah, we've done primarily adding to the salaries of folks in compensation to pay for additional for bilingual staff. And we're trying to roll that into the entire complete compensation package, which looks at really the well-being of the human beings at Mountain Family. Yeah. So I could go down a different rabbit hole talking about the well-being of our staff, but I'll stop there and wait for that question later.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that. That actually brings me to one of your points, Brian, around tokenism, right? And the idea of oftentimes the people that are asked to do this work are the people representing the identities that you want to see more of. So if you want more diversity, you go to BIPOC staff, you go to the staff who represent some form of marginalization, and you say, can you do this work? So two-part question. One is, who do you suggest should be doing this work internally? Like, who should take this work on? And the second is, how do you, if you have no other choice but that person that is, representing that community, how do you ensure that they don't feel tokenized? How do you, alleviate that feeling, if there are any ways? I think one way is what you just said, Ross, and that's actually valuing the work and the additional work they're doing by compensating them. That's studies show that is a way that you keep people, by honoring that additional work, that additional even kind of mental and emotional labor that you have to bring forth for that work. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on who should do this work, where should it live, and how do you make sure that you don't veer into the tokenism land?
I'm sorry, was that a question for me or was that for us?
Yes, Brian, do you
Okay.
mind? Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would love to hear your
Um,
ideas, like who should be doing this work? Where should it live?
No, I think that that's a really good point of, a lot of times this work does fall on whatever diverse staff you do have. And I'm speaking from personal experience with that as well, is that, I'm the kind of person that this is something that I really care about and that I'm passionate about. And so I don't mind being in those spaces and really pushing the organization or pushing the staff to really think about these issues, but that doesn't apply to everyone, and so a lot of times there would also be instances of people being like, oh, since Brian is the only person that's bilingual, make him translate, or if somebody calls in and they can only speak in Spanish, oh, send them to Brian. And so being really mindful of that and having a candid and honest conversation with the staff and just saying, what are you comfortable with? And at the same time, what are you not comfortable with? And really not trying to impose projects or ideas or expectations on people, but really coming from their lens and coming from where they're at and where they want to be in this work is, I think, really critical, because there are going to be people that are like, I don't want to have any part of this process, and that's fine. And so really being mindful of where they're at and what kind of things they're willing to take on is going to be really, really critical, and not pushing things on them. And to the tokenization piece, I think once again, it takes a lot of that humility and understanding and knowing that they have a different lived experience than you. And so how are you being mindful of that? Are you asking, your white colleagues that are in that same space to speak for their whole community? Probably not. And so there's that double-edged sword of somebody who might be a person of color or LGBTQ plus or another underrepresented group, to say, since they do have that lived experience, that they do have this different sort of knowledge that the other counterparts might not have. So how do you balance that respectfully of saying, we know that you know things that we don't know. So how do we do that in a respectful way to say, we want to do this very through a humble lens, without also asking you and just exploiting all your lived experience and knowledge for our gain. And so I think it also comes back to like that reciprocity that Ross also talked about of, are you compensating? Are you valuing their skills and knowledge for what it is? And how does that relation go in both directions?
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I appreciate those answers. What I heard from you loud and clear is that it's very powerful to communicate and to name things, to name it. If you're asking someone to do something, to name the why and to actually unpack it with them and to ask. That is a very simple, inexpensive mechanism to utilize in beginning this work. So thank you for that. You both touched on the challenge of promoting and uplifting. So let's talk a little bit about that. Ross, I'd love to hear, I'm sure you've had to be very creative around, retention strategies for how you keep people within the organization, how you begin to flip the dynamic of, the senior level people not looking like those who are more junior level staff and the junior level staff being more representative of your community. What are the ways that you think about development and uplifting people from a professional development and an engagement perspective?
Thanks, Maisha. Great question. So I'm kind of a strategic planning nerd. So we in our strategic plan have what we call our quadruple aim, and we stole a lot of these ideas from the Institute for Healthcare Improvement on how we improve healthcare across the United States, since healthcare is a pretty broken system across the United States. But the point of that is within our strategic plan, one of our 4 pillars that uphold the goals of our organization is to empower an engaged workforce, that the human beings at Mountain Family are of equal import to the financial well-being, quality outcomes, and the patient experience within our organization. That is the way in which we value and say, from a strategic, longitudinal, long-term perspective, we value human beings. We value uplifting human beings from our communities to have good paying jobs and to serve our community. That's the nice vision. Practically, it takes a lot more blood, sweat, and tears to try to execute on that and to try to change the trajectory where our executive team and our medical providers are from our communities. So the ways in which we're trying to tackle that is really over the long run, and there are no short-term fixes to that. But some things that I think are working really well that show a lot of promise are programs like the pre-collegiate programs in the local high schools, where our professional teams help mentor up and coming high school students, especially students from families that don't have any generation before them that have gone to college. That gives high school students the opportunity to see, like, okay, this is what it takes to become a physician within my community, or to become a nurse, or to become a CFO, or to become an IT professional. So that partnership with local high schools and really mentoring folks from families that don't have a lot of collegiate experience is really important to build the long-term pipeline for the future workforce. Then at the college level, partnerships with a group like the DU School of Social Work here in Glenwood Springs is a great partnership that allows local people to train and get their master's in social work, and then come back to, not really come back, stay in community and then serve community. So about half of our behavioral health providers at Mountain Family today went through the DU MSW program, and building that program here in local community has allowed us to have a much more diverse, from a gender perspective and a race and ethnicity perspective, behavioral health workforce. As we then think about the long-term future for medical providers and dental providers, we're trying to build partnerships with Colorado Mountain College for dental hygiene so that folks can train in community and then serve in community. And then with the Colorado Mesa University out of Grand Junction for physician assistants and other healthcare providers. So kind of a long-winded answer, but we've set a strategy, and now we're trying to practically execute on that strategy by building educational partnerships from high school through college through postgraduate education.
I love that. I love the emphasis on starting so early and really thinking about how do you kind of bring people on, well before they enter the workforce. Really, I think that's really a part of the community building. That's great. Brian, anything on that question around developing talent and keeping people?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And thank you, Ross, for your comments. I definitely agree with that. Starting early, showing that commitment and investment to growing the talent within the community, and then how that pays off career-wise, I think is really important. And I think that ultimately goes back to that concept of reciprocity. How does that relationship really go both ways? Thinking again about who are you promoting, who has the highest salaries, because that all shows through your daily work, and also who is getting that professional development, who is getting those opportunities, and who is front of line for those, or are they being offered generally. And then again, compensating for the skills and knowledge that are specific and that don't necessarily seem like one of those things that are high up on people's lists at the same rate as, like, knowing how to use QuickBooks it has a different kind of valuation than somebody who's bilingual, where one of them is like a must-have or really nice to have versus another one is, kind of nice to have, depending on the population that you're working with. So really being critical about those different skills and knowledge that people have, and that cultural connection that they have, and not underestimating it, and really valuing it for what it is really important. And it also gives the employee that sense of, I feel valued by my employer for the different aspects and the different things that I bring to the table, not just my hard skills. And then also being really critical and thoughtful about, are you imposing responsibilities? Are you imposing job tasks? Or are you really asking them for, what do you want out of this job, and what can we help you with your own professional development? And really taking it from that lens of, what is it that you want to focus on? Because when you're in a job that you're doing things that you don't have an interest in, it's not going to work, right? And so really thinking about, what do you want to do and what are you interested in? What are you passionate about? And how can we align both the organizational needs and your professional needs together? And then lastly, just thinking about where are you really coming from with all of this work? Like, what are the emotions behind it and what is the intention behind it? And who is bought into this notion? Is it company wide? Is it executive leadership wide? Is it staff wide? Does it kind of stay in the staff? Who is brought in or bought into the North Star, I guess?
Great, thank you. I love what you mentioned around, kind of really thinking about how to match people's aspirations with what they can do. Having been in smaller environments, that's one thing that you can do is when you're a smaller business, you can be more nimble. You have the ability to do that more often and to allow people to grow from the seat they're in to get better professionally, even if it doesn't mean growing up throughout the hierarchy. So I think that was great. I'm going to pivot a little bit. We talked about retaining people. We talked about, diving into equity, but I'm sure there are lots of people listening who are thinking, well, how do I access the talent? That's often the big question. How do I access the talent? How do I, win the war for talent in a small environment? Phased another way, what can businesses do to connect with talent in an environment like the Roaring Fork Valley? What are some of the creative ideas or just ideas in general that you would encourage?
I'll hop in there. Thanks, Maisha. I will go back to taking a long view approach of human beings and raising up human beings from our communities to serve our communities and to ultimately lead our businesses over the long run. I think that's an important leadership perspective that I would encourage for-profits, nonprofits, government entities, and all businesses within our community to think through how are we investing in the well-being of our community by uplifting people from our community. Some of the educational partnerships I referenced, I think many different industries can pursue those. Mentoring folks at the high school level or even at the middle school level to start to build career paths and perhaps more importantly, build inspiration of, I didn't know I could do that. This is what it takes to become the CEO of the Aspen Skiing Company. This is what it takes to become a physician, or this was what it takes to become those professions that seem really far off in my life. Having good mentors in one's life, I think, helps people really realize what the possibilities are. So I would really encourage all of our business partners to think through how are they building for the long run, investing in mentoring, investing in educational relationships to help build the workforce from our communities. The other point I would go back to is looking within oneself, not only self-critically, as Brian advocated for, which is very wise, but looking at who are our customers, who are our clients, who are our patients. When I do new hire orientation at Mountain Family every other Monday, which is one of the favorite parts of my job, I ask folks how they heard about Mountain Family and how they came to us. And more than half of the time, folks will say, well, I'm a patient of Mountain Family. I'm a consumer, I'm a customer of yours already. And the care I received inspired me to want to work for that organization, to work for your organization. So I think the point there is you have lots of customers and clients or patients, and you should be thinking about, well, what are the services we're providing and who are the talent within our customer base that actually buy into our mission or buy into our values that could be great employees for the long run.
Awesome. I'm going to double click on what you said. You weren't looking for credit, but I love that you do the new hire orientation in your role as CEO. That's something that that many people should aspire to do.
It's one of the best parts of my job, honestly. It's a lot better than spreadsheets or negotiations.
That's awesome. Brian, anything on the, finding talent, connecting with talent?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that long run view that Ross brings to this and that he brings to Mountain Family. It really is, how are you investing from early on to later in life, and kind of throughout that journey, and how much is the investment there? So I think that was a really good point. And I would also say to, I bring it back a lot to the personal level of saying you have to be critical of yourself and also question, like, who is my existing network? That has a lot to do of being able to share out job opportunities, who am I already connected with, and who do I know is out there that, you know, which relationships have you and do you value, and which ones are the ones that you've put the most effort into building, and who could be missing from that, I think is really, really important to think about and to be really critical about. And then when you think about that and you notice that there are certain groups of people missing from your networks, again, thinking about how do you reach out if you want to go and reach out to somebody that you know is a Latino leader or something like that. What place is your heart really coming from? Like, are you doing it to check a box, or are you genuinely thinking, hey, this is something that I want to work on personally and that I want to invest the time and effort in to really grow my networks and do it in a sincere, compassionate way? And so I think that that's really important. And I think it also has to do with doing your own research of, don't expect, like we mentioned earlier, underrepresented people to have all the answers for you and to have all the answers for your questions. It shouldn't be our jobs to connect you to other underrepresented community members. So I think doing your own research, and also thinking about, like, how are you advertising? If you're posting a job, are you doing it through newspapers? Not to, bag on newspapers, but that's a very select audience. And so being really critical about, how are you advertising? Where are you advertising? And what are the audiences that are going to be reached through those mechanisms?
Wonderful. I'm going to just sit here just for another few seconds and say, I appreciate both of your answers. If for the sake of our audience, if someone's saying, well, I love the idea of the long run view, taking kind of long end approach, like Ross said, but what if I have a director role I need to fill right now, and I want to fill it with someone who, hopefully mirrors the demographic of who we're serving or the community around us? Where do I find that person? I heard you're expanding your networks. You're challenging yourself to be very expansive by asking the question, who is missing in my own network? That requires a lot of introspection right there. But what else? Is there anything rapid fire you can tell people in this moment if they're looking for roles in the area? What could they do? Where should they go?
I would just add to that, ask your staff, ask your customers, ask your board or your governing body, along with being interrogating and trying to expand your own network.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I'd agree with Ross.
Great. All right, I'm keeping an eye on time. I'm gonna do one more question and then we'll open it up to see if others have questions. And I'm gonna ask just for some general advice or some do's and don'ts with regard to small businesses, for small businesses with regard to equity and HR practices. What are some, kind of general do's and don'ts that we didn't touch on in those few questions earlier, but that you wanna make sure you get across to our audience?
I can go first. So I mentioned a couple already. I think that, one of the biggest ones for me is that tokenization piece, which is, a little bit farther ahead in the game of, once you bring on diverse staff and leadership onto your team, how are you actually treating them once they're there? Like I said, diversity is not the same as equity and inclusion, and making sure that those spaces and that power is being shared, and that those spaces are really empowering and not tokenizing the folks that are in there and expecting them to speak for their entire community. And so just being really mindful of what might I be expecting of this new staff person, or whatever the case might be, that is different from what I would expect from the rest of my team. So being really critical and reflective of that. And I think, again, doing your own research, a lot of this work is very self-reflective and being very critical about yourself and your organization as a whole, and the different pieces of how your structure is internally, how it is perceived by the community, and also by your clients or customers, or whatever the case might be. I think it takes a lot of that introspection and being really critical and being willing to embrace that feeling of uncomfortableness to do this work. And I think that, just really quickly on a personal note, there was, at the beginning of the COVID outbreak, since everybody was working from home, and there was a lot of need just because of the fact that all these businesses were shutting down, and there were a lot of community members that needed assistance, either economic, mental health, whatever the case might be. But prior to that point, coming from my nonprofit perspective, there wasn't that really true engagement, specifically with the Latino, Latinx community prior to COVID, at least not at a sector-wide level. And COVID was what really shocked people and made everybody realize, hey, we're actually not connected very well to the Latino, Latinx community. And so I think bringing it back to that place of what are our ultimate intentions and what have we done thus far to also earn that trust from the community and not just expect it to be there.
All great points, Brian. Thank you. Ross?
I think I would just add, I don't have a lot of don'ts, but the do's and the encouragements would be for us each as leaders to be curious about the cultures of our staff, of others, and of our community, to try to pursue cultural humility by listening, by doing a little less talking and a little more listening and hearing other people's stories. We are part of a broad-based organizing group called the Mountain Voices Project, MVP. And that has been a really good space for me as a CEO who's used to talking a lot and being in a lot of board meetings and being, the voice and the face a lot of the time, to stop and to be quiet and to listen to other people's stories. And as I think about what our communities ultimately need, I think it's a sense of humility and listening so that we can grow together.
I couldn't agree more. It's a great place to pause and see if we have any questions from our audience. Wait, we can't hear you, Evan. Oh, there you go.
The requisite you're on mute for every webinar. I've been scribbling furiously, and we do have several questions. So a lot of this entire series that we're doing is a collaboration with the chambers of commerce between Aspen and Parachute, and there's a chamber for every community in that 80-mile corridor. So that said, these questions sound like they're coming from chamber members. Somebody asks, what is the best way to cultivate culture that is hospitable and welcoming for small businesses? I mean, really small. These could be retail shops or automotive shops, or I don't mean the big, this is a hospital or this is a school, big institutions, municipalities and county governments. I'm talking about small little companies, small businesses. And they don't have a budget to hire a bunch of people all at once where they can kind of create this overnight welcoming culture. What are suggestions that you might have for small businesses that are really just bringing on people one at a time? Does that make sense? Does that question make sense? And I would just ask this of Maisha and the rest of and Ross and Brian.
I'll take a pass at that. I think it's a great question. I think building culture is essential to, the sustainability of any company, business, organization, anywhere. I think even no matter how small you are, you can start with your values. What are your values? What do you value, and how is that displayed? And I'm actually thinking of like a storefront. If you are a retail business and you have maybe 5 to 10 staff people, you do a little bit of a values project where you decide what are our values. Well, how do we communicate those to our community? And then how do we find time to open up to the community and allow them in, and they can see our values in action, whether that's an afternoon where you say, there's, come in and experience or see what we have to offer. And we talk about who we are. We tell you who we are. That doesn't require, glossy marketing materials as much as it requires, as one of my colleagues earlier said, storytelling. Storytelling is a beautiful vehicle to breaking down so many barriers between people, between communities, and really building a sense of, okay, who are we together? And so using storytelling, getting to know people in any way, something as simple as, allowing people to opt into a mailing list and maybe sharing out with that mailing list. Here, we've been working on our values. Here's our value of the month. Here's how you'll see that reflected in our materials, in our, in our store, in our whatever we are offering. But make it, very specific to you. You don't have to take something that bigger organizations use all the time. You can actually really make it customized to who you are and representative of how you want to connect and how you usually do connect with the community. And I'll stop there and see if others have comments.
Those are some great points. I actually jotted a couple of them down. I was like, oh, that's a good point. So thank you for that, Maisha. And, going back to what Ross talks about too, about that humility piece, I think is really important and defining your equity. Like, what does that really mean to you? And what does that mean to your business or organization? There's equity for child development, there's equity in business. So really thinking about and defining, like, what does equity mean for you and for your staff and for your organization or business, is really important to, like Maisha said, to define those values and make sure that you get team buy-in to them, because if it just lives with one person, then that feeds into the company culture. And so doing it in a collaborative way, in a way that you get that team buy-in and participation to build that culture together, I think is really important. And, again, I'm going to bring it back to being self-critical, like what culture exists now, being critical about that, and just being really self-reflective of that, like what culture exists now and what culture do we want to aspire to, I think is a big piece of it too.
Thanks, Maisha and Brian. I'll just add, any business of any size can always ask their staff or their customers what they really want, and listen to those answers, and then think through culturally, what do we want to do and act on based on those answers.
And actually, Evan, can I just add one quick thing? Is that you mentioned, if you're growing one by one, person by person, when that person comes on, a lot, like we mentioned earlier with Ross, doing onboarding or orientation, making sure you're baking in the values to that, instead of just throwing it behind a cash register or onto the phone or into a PowerPoint presentation. Take the time to say, here's who we are, here's our values, here's how we like to live them, here are some norms that are community agreements that we have as a business, and here's how we expect you to live. Here are the behaviors that attach to those values. And you're constantly kind of reiterating those so that new people can kind of be fully ingrained in what they are, as opposed to just having to observe and kind of get, more intuitively what they are. Actually state them and train people on the values just the way you would train them on the functionality.
So the next question is kind of a follow-up to that, which I think is brilliant. This is more from the perspective of the employee. How do we, because we've largely been talking to the employers, right, and the boards of directors and the HR professionals. This is more from the perspective of the person in the trenches, the person that's on the scene that might be feeling the weight of all of this. How do we name the elephant in the room? How do we help empower our employees to have these tough conversations without, this is awkward stuff. And I think the entire country is kind of grappling with, how do we have these difficult conversations? Do you have any suggestions for employees specifically to sort of advance some of these discussions in ways that can feel productive without putting them in really vulnerable positions?
I'll take that on. Or do you want to go? I actually want to hear what you say first, Ross. Do you want to go first?
I think the most honest, authentic answer is, I don't feel like we're great at executing on that, Evan, in a way that is not scary for folks. So, we've started trying to be more transparent in how we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion at Mountain Family. And that starts with me being honest about what we do really well, and being honest about the bottom line truth that the highest paid people within our organization are not from, for the most part, not from our communities and not from Latinx or Hispanic backgrounds. But I do not feel like we as an organization have really created that safe space to empower all 200 employees to be able to move this forward. So I think it's a great question. I'm going to have to think about How do we evolve and mature as an organization to create that space? I think one area that we've been doing over the last year is in our biannual or twice a year employee engagement survey. We started asking questions about, do you feel that your employer pursues health equity? Do you feel that your employer promotes equity in HR and promotions? Questions like that create a little bit more of a dialogue to help us. But I would honestly rank us pretty low in terms of being able to do that gracefully.
Well, that's honest, Ross. I might lean on Maisha a little bit for this one.
Yeah, and I also want to give Brian a space too if he has a response, but I think this one is tough. I'll be honest. And I actually, to speak to something Brian mentioned before, as much as you want to empower employees to have the space and feel comfortable, it's actually on the employer to create that space. It's on us. So it's on the employer to have opportunities for people to give feedback anonymously or in a way that you don't necessarily know where it's coming from. Maybe you have a team meeting and you ask people to put, an idea, in a box, or, you kind of pull it out anonymously and say, let's talk about this. You actually have them contribute to the topic, by making it very, level, making it feel very level of where it's coming from. So you don't know, you can't pinpoint where the concern is coming from. Also, people, I think for the employees, it's utilizing, if you have an HR staff person, I don't want to assume everybody does, because again, we're talking about small businesses. So if you don't, I think there's probably always one person where you feel like you can be honest with and talk to. And when you can get that one person bought in and you hear yourself talk about your issue with that person, and that is empowering. So when you can talk to that person and say, well, I'm going to talk to another person, and you can begin to work your way through, then you can bring it to a bigger group, and you really have some, you have some allies, you have some folks who are, co-conspirators, if you will, to say, you know what, I see that too, or I can see exactly what you mean, and to give you kind of the, the support you need in that moment. That can be very helpful, but I don't want to take it off of the employer. What is the onus on all of us to make sure that the space, that we're providing the space, and we're breaking down any of those, silos where people feel like they can't talk and communicate. That's really important.
Brian?
Yeah, I really appreciate what Ross and Maisha have said, especially about, being more transparent and being transparent about where you are now. I think is really important, and that obviously still falls on the employer. And I really appreciated Maisha's point about the talking to somebody that you trust and building that allyship, and helping you be seen and to have that leverage to say, you know what, these people are here with me, they agree with me, they want to help out in whatever the circumstance may be. But I think more specifically to my thoughts on this question for employees, I think first and foremost, as an employee, you deserve to be respected and valued for all that you are and all that you bring to the table and to the organization. I think that, like I mentioned earlier, you have to make that that space. And like Ross and Maisha were talking about, that oftentimes falls on the employer to be able to cultivate and create that space for the staff. But generally speaking, that space has to exist there. And like Ross said, these are tough conversations. You have to acknowledge and embrace that vulnerability that you will feel as an employee and that you will feel as an employer. And they also acknowledge the power dynamics that exist in those conversations of who ultimately makes the decisions in that space. And, this is a conversation about retention. And I think my bottom line is, if you are an employee that doesn't feel valued or appreciated or understood or heard in a given space, and you frankly don't have to stay there. And I think that that's the thing that employees will need to grapple with, is employees have that right to say, you know what, this isn't working for me. And so I'm going to go find a different place that has a different culture that really embraces me for who I am and all that I bring to the table.
We've got a little bit more time. I love this question. What is the ideal vision? What is the ideal outcome? Where are we going with all of this? And Maisha, I'm going to ask you this. If we had this conversation at the vision endpoint, on that vision horizon, can you describe for us what the experience would be for people?
Yeah, and I'm imagining that's coming from, basically all of these efforts in equity and HR, like what the end kind of vision entails. Okay. Um, I think it goes back to understanding and deciding, well, what equity, diversity, and inclusion look like for you. And when you couple that with your values and what makes sense for you, then you can get to the vision part. That doesn't look the same for everybody. It doesn't have to be that every organization is, so perfectly diverse. It has representation from everyone across every walk of life. That's not always possible. You can aim for that, but that's not always possible. But you can decide that it's important to you to break down the barriers that you see existing in your community. And that can mean around access. If you find that you're not getting enough people who are Latino or Latinx or Indigenous applying to jobs, how do you find ways to break that down? Ross has already named some ways to break down those barriers early on, so that you're creating pipelines into your into your businesses. If you decide that you need more women, you need more women who are moving up the ranks of leadership, that could be what you aspire to, right? But understanding what equity should look like for you is largely going to be who you are, what you do, what sector you operate in, and your values. You overlay all that together. That vision should be pretty easy to come to and say, you know what, we want to be more of these things, more diverse, meaning we want to have more representation of those who are in this field naturally, who are in the space around us, who we serve. Mirroring the demographic of the community you serve can be for businesses, nonprofits, anyone. And just looking out on who is, around the community. How do you pull those people in? Equity is, how do we make sure that we are looking at things through an equity lens across all aspects of the employee life cycle? And that just takes time to think through, okay, what does recruiting look like through equity? What does the compensation look like through equity? That takes time. And then inclusion, how do you want to be more inclusive? Again, going back to your values and how you want to live those out, you should be able to create a pretty good vision for what you want to look like. And sometimes it's short term, look like in the near state, and then sometimes it's future state. It's not always, oh, this is what you want to look like and it's going to stay that way. You're going to grow and evolve. Sometimes it's right now, let's get through COVID and figure out what we're going to look like post COVID, and then future state after that. Hopefully what we're looking at like after COVID is healthy, inclusive people feeling like they can, be back in a work environment, whether physically or virtually, and feel accepted and feel like they can bring their whole life and self and circumstances to work. Some of those barriers around authentically bringing yourself to work are being broken down naturally in the pandemic. So maybe it's that for you. All those things may come into play, but it has to start with you deciding, who do you want to be? What do you want to be? Because if you don't know and you're thinking, I want to look like that organization or that business, it's never going to work. So I wish I could be more tangible, but I think you start with who you are and your values, and then figure out aspirationally kind of where you can get to.
Well, that was perfect. I'm so grateful to all of you, and in the interest of full transparency, I will add that the Aspen Institute is doing this work. We behind the scenes, Maisha is helping the Aspen Institute as an organization nationwide and globally really grapple with some of these big important questions. And we have ongoing working groups that meet regularly, and we kind of unpack some of these big, tough, difficult, awkward conversations. And we do them through the lens of curiosity and really trying to get to the heart of who we want to be and what we value most, and how can we deliver on that, not only for ourselves, but for the broader community that we seek to serve. So I'm so grateful for all of you and your expertise and wisdom and sharing with all of us. And for those that are watching, thank you for joining today's inaugural First Community Initiative Town Hall Speaker Series. This presentation was the second of 8 webinar events broadcasting every 2 weeks from now through the end of July. You're invited to register for more events in this series at aspen2parachute.org, and that's the number 2, aspen2parachute.org. Our next presentation will be Tuesday, May 18th from noon to 1 p.m. Mountain Time on the topic of ag tech. And that's a hashtag, ag tech. And that is going to be focused on a look into the future of farming for rural Colorado, brought to you by the Western Garfield County Chamber of Commerce and the Silt Branch Library. And we're going to be featuring Charles Barr, who's the CEO and founder of Springborn Inc., Springborn Inc. is a new automated indoor high-tech lettuce growing operation in Silt, Colorado. We're also going to have on our panel Jeff Lehman, who's the town administrator for Silt. We're also going to have a special guest, a representative from App Harvest, is an ag tech B Corp company reshaping the future of farming in rural Kentucky. Supposedly, they have the largest automated greenhouse in the country. A very, very slick operation that I am really excited to learn more about. Our esteemed moderator for that event is going to be Corby Coomer, Executive Director of Aspen Institute's own Food and Society program. We're very excited about having him moderate. Together, we'll learn about ag tech and what it can mean for rural farmers of Western Garfield County. Again, that's May 18th from noon to 1 p.m. Mountain Time via Zoom. Registration for this and other upcoming events in the HCI Town Hall Speaker Series, as well as recorded replays from previous events, can be found at aspen2parachute.org. Special thanks to Garfield County Libraries for co-hosting this and all other events of the HCI Town Hall Speaker Series. I'm Evan Zislis. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.